I'm Carrie Flynn. I'm the Education Director with the Genocide Education Project. And this is our first of 4 webinars in a series this year as we prepare to commemorate the 110th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, April 24th, 2025. So we're really excited to have you here with us tonight, and it looks like we're okay. So let's go ahead and jump in. So tonight's webinar is going to be 90 minutes or less. So what you can expect, this is really for beginning educators. We're going to talk about how to teach genocide, ways to teach genocide, offer you some different free resources that we have on our website, and begin an exploration of Armenian history and Armenian culture. And of course, along the way, we will pause for questions and discussion. So if you have questions as we are going along, please feel free to drop them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, and then when we get to a pause, we will go ahead and address those questions for you. Like I said, I'm Carrie Flynn. I was a 25-year veteran of the classroom. I've since retired to become the education director. I have been on our GenEd fellowship trips 3 years now, so it's been really exciting, both as a participant and as somebody in charge, which was kind of scary, but it was really, really fun. And that's something that we can talk about toward the end of tonight's session as well, is our teacher fellowship program, if you're interested in that. But the Genocide Education Project was created about 20 years ago in San Francisco by a group of teachers and community leaders who were concerned about how educators were going to teach the state mandate on the Armenian Genocide. And so our founding member, Roxanne Muscatian, is here with us tonight. And so it's always lovely to have her here. So if we have additional questions, we have her expertise as well. First tonight, let's talk about pedagogy, how we should be teaching genocide, safe ways to teach genocide that will help us achieve our goals. Because of course, if we're teaching genocide, there's a reason we want to engage in this. It's not easy. So there's a reason we find this important. And I'm sure we're all here for the same reason, and that is that people's lives matter. So our pedagogy needs to be reflective of our mission. We also need to be very cognizant that this is difficult material. It's difficult for us as the educators. It's difficult for our students. It can be difficult for our communities. And so we need to be willing to step back and say, this is difficult today. Today I need a rest. Today we need to find something lighter. That is absolutely okay. And we need to be aware of that. You need to be reading your students, which I know you do. You also need to be meeting your students at their social emotional development level. Some things are more appropriate for different ages. Some things just based on their development. I know as I was leaving the classroom, there was a lot of discussion about our students being less mature, and that being perhaps a part of the long-term ramifications of the pandemic. So just being cognizant of where our children are and what they can and cannot handle. And always please practice safe in, safe out. That means that your children, your students come in safe. You give them this very tough information, but you give them the time and space to decompress. And by the time they leave your class, they are leaving safely. They are in a good space psychologically. And that also goes for you. This can be really difficult, and especially if you're teaching multiple hours in a row. So give yourself the grace that you also need to feel safe in and out. When we teach genocide, we might be teaching one genocide, a specific genocide, or we might be teaching several. When I was in the classroom, I taught a class called Human Rights and Genocide. So I taught many genocides. It's really important to remember that each genocide is unique. It's its own event. It has its own human beings in it. So we want to avoid comparisons of pain, comparisons of this one was worse than that one based on the number of people that were murdered. Those aren't really helpful. We all know that pain is subjective, and how each individual person processes any kind of pain is a subjective experience. Of course, we don't want to put our children or our students in the shoes of survivors or perpetrators or victims. That's really not a situation we ever wish them to be in as human beings. So be mindful of those things is really important. Sometimes my students, especially, and I'm sure yours will too, they want to know what's wrong with the perpetrators, like what could cause somebody to do these horrible things that they're doing. It's really important to not give them a flippant answer. Sometimes it's just nicer to believe that there's something wrong with those people, and I think we could make an argument that, there is something wrong with those people. But when we look at the basic psychology of them, they are just human beings. They're committing the actions that they're committing for a myriad of reasons, one of which could be that they're not good people. They don't have a good moral compass, but probably it's more aligned with what they're allowed to do by their society, by their government. What they're doing isn't getting them ostracized, or they're expected to participate. And so those are areas where you want to, if you don't want to engage in those kinds of sociological discussions, we want to be sure that we're not just giving kids simple answers, because there aren't simple answers to these complicated, complex questions. And unfortunately, human beings can show us their basest behaviors, and they can also show us their greatness. So it's important to remember that while we can see really awful things, we also know human beings are capable of really lovely things as well, especially in the case of rescue. And people can be multifaceted. There's plenty of cases where a perpetrator rescues somebody simply because he knows them or she knows them. So we want to make sure that our students know that people are dynamic, they're not static. In this day and age, it is really important to know your sources and know that the resources and the sources that you're using are vetted, they're reliable, they're accurate. We don't want to go about teaching things that are inaccurate, because that just opens the doorway to denial. It undermines the memory of the victims and the survivors. So it's really important that as you're going out and you're collecting different resources, or you're doing your own research, that you are using those good media savvy skills that we are teaching our students, to make sure that you're not falling into any of those kinds of conspiracy theory traps or denialistic tropes. Because if you don't know any better, you may not know that you're being manipulated. The Turkish government denies the Armenian genocide, for example, and their media is very slick. So unless you really know that that is their goal, is denial, because that's been their mantra since 1915, you might find their information more credible than it actually is. We also want to choose resources that are appropriate for our students, their social emotional development, as well as our academic standards and goals for teaching the genocide. We want to make sure that we're still engaging in high-level instructional practices. And of course, the reason why most of us are going to teach genocide is that we want to teach about humans. We want to humanize this history. We want our students to see the people, the victims, the survivors, the descendants. We want them to recognize that each person had an identity. They had their name, they had their dreams, they had hopes. and whether or not they survived the way that they had hoped that their life would turn out was altered greatly. And that is just a really human element. And I think that's just such an important part of teaching genocide, is humanizing the history and helping our translate statistics into human beings. Because learning that 1.5 million Armenians were murdered during the genocide is important. It's also really important that students understand their individual lives, that they get somebody telling them what their experience was like, whether it's, through survivor testimony, in a video or audio or memoir. It's really important for our students to be able to make these kinds of human connections. And by doing this, we can help our students prepare for their action. What are they going to do with this information? Obviously, learning about genocide is extremely important from a historical perspective, from the never again perspective. But we could just teach the genocide and leave it there. But it's a good idea, especially when your students become passionate, to give them ways that they can engage in change. It helps empower them. It helps them fight for what's right here in history, but also it gives them the skills and the tools they need to fight for what's right in their own lifetimes, in their own worlds, so that we can start working up to and living up to never again. I do want to take a moment to talk a little bit about the photos that I've chosen so far in this presentation for you tonight. These were all taken from Armenian databases that I know are extremely reliable. And I chose them because we're going to practice safe in and safe out. A nice way to start is to see these pictures of families. We're looking at the children now, and having this kind of human connection to a culture that you may not be familiar with, or people you may not be familiar with. And hopefully by looking at them, both, when I use this with you and you use this with your students, you can start seeing the humanity and the connection in each person. Like, they're going to school, they're wearing a uniform. If your students wear uniforms, there's a connection. Of course, we have the teacher in the middle. And one thing I want to impart with you before we move on with our topic is that when we choose pictures, we need to be very cognizant of who is in our pictures and what they're doing. Like this picture, for example, this is a studio picture. I would presume that everybody in this picture consented to having their picture made. And then it was archived and saved and wound up in one of our digital archives here in the States. When we look at genocide pictures, we can find pictures of the genocide where people didn't have a choice. They couldn't consent, yes or no. They wouldn't have consented to the situation they were in, and much less they wouldn't have consented to having their picture taken, especially of their nude corpses, or in their different states of torture. So it's important for us to remember that. And I think it really helped my students when we would do photo activities. I would give them that advice, make sure that if you're choosing a photo that is compromising of somebody, that is nude, that shows them in the worst situation that we can imagine them to be in, that you're using it not for gratuitous reasons, but because it's going to make your point, and only use it if it's going to make your point, because these are humans. And that really helped my students embrace this respect for our victims and for our survivors. So just bear that in mind. There's a time and a place, and you're going to know when that's right, but it's also not a bad idea to suggest it to your students and explain this philosophy with them, because it really does help deepen their empathetic connection to other human beings. Okay, so we're going to take a pause. Seda, do we have any questions? If somebody wants to ask a question, that's also lovely right now. Or
Well, there's
comments.
nothing at the moment, unless somebody wants to pop a question in right now. Yeah, I don't.
All right,
Oh,
well, as we go on, if you do have questions or you need something clarified, please take a note of it and we will come back to it at our next pause. When we decide to teach about genocide, we need to be very accurate in our language and define what is genocide. Before the Holocaust, this word doesn't exist. It's not in our lexicon. It's actually it comes into our language from Raphael Lemkin, who's a Polish Jewish lawyer who was studying what had happened to the Armenians. And he coins the word genocide. And he begins working toward getting this idea of genocide recognized and making it a crime to commit specifically genocide. Um, why is the killing of a million a lesser crime than the killing of a single individual? And that was his point. The perpetrators of the Armenian genocide largely went unpunished. And so Lemkin was working through the 20s and into the 30s on trying to get the world to take some action and notice of this. Lemkin is able to leave Poland before the Nazis invade in 1939. However, most of his family does not survive the Holocaust. After the war, with the formation of the United Nations, he really pushes this crime of genocide. And it really is thanks to Lemkin and his efforts that we have this recognized as an international crime today. So let's define this law. So the UN Convention on Genocide was passed on December 9th of 1948. The convention defines genocide as any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of one group to another. So take a moment, if you're not very familiar with this, just to try to absorb some of this. And then I'm going to ask you a couple different things I want you to consider, questions I would ask my students. So when you're thinking about the convention, is there any need of updating? We're talking about a law that was written in 1948. We know society has changed since then. So what are some ways we would want this updated? It's a great way for students to kind of begin to dig in, kind of break this apart. They begin to recognize which groups aren't recognized. And so that really helps set that tone for them that they can see like, okay, we're working with a law, but our law is a little dated, it's a little outdated, and we need to maybe come back to it and to open it back up. Some groups that my students will point out are the LGBTQ groups, which in 1948, socially, this was an unaccepted group, and in fact was still prosecuted as a crime in many nations. So this really does need to be updated. Um, political groups, political groups are not represented here, and so that's an interesting distinction as well. And then I always ask them, what are the flaws and gaps in this legal definition? So take a moment and think about what are some of these legal flaws and gaps. My students will always point out to me, well, this is after the fact, it's already happened. Why are we not doing something to keep it from happening? And they're absolutely right. We know that there are prevention measures in the world that hopefully do work. And maybe we don't recognize them as working simply because genocide didn't happen. So we kind of explore that idea. Um, the whole premise of numbers, killing members of a group, how many is that? We go back to our intent to destroy. Um, does that include other aspects? Is it just human life? Is it cultural? There's a lot of different ways your students will explore this with you. And I always think it's just nice to give them that space to kind of wrestle with what are we really examining? So I think that's just really nice to be able to have our students kind of wrestle with the law itself. And of course, if you have any confusion or questions on these yourself, please, we will get to another pause and we will take those then. But also with your students, the children part usually tripped mine up, transferring children of the group to another. Unfortunately, there's lots of examples of that even here in the US. So there's different ways to explore this and engage your students. So our first resource that we want to point out to you is called Stages of Genocide. This is a free download. So if you go to our website at genocideeducation.org, you can click on teacher resources and scroll down, and this is free for your use, for your classroom use. And we think it's a really great resource for a variety of reasons. Not all of us have a Holocaust and Genocide Studies class, perhaps. I did, so I could spend lots of time on different cases, and that was really helpful for me. But if I don't have that opportunity, I can actually talk about several different cases of genocide in a much shorter period of time. The cases that are included are listed here. I want to point out that when this curriculum unit was developed, the decision to include these specific genocides was based on resource availability and collaboration. It does not mean that these are more important than any other genocide that is not included. The Holodomor is not included in this for a variety of reasons, but none of those reasons are because it didn't happen or it's not important. So I want to make sure that you understand that this is not the end-all list. This is just a compilation of some. And hopefully in the future, we will be able to come back to those cases that are left out here and begin to work on creating their cases for a supplement as well.
Hey, Carrie, there's a really good question in the chat
Yeah.
that I would love if Dekran could unmute himself and answer it, unless you want to answer it or Roxanne wants to answer it. But it says, if the Ottoman Empire perpetrated the Armenian genocide, Turkey didn't exist yet. Why does Turkey still deny the Armenian genocide?
So I somewhat answered it, I think.
Okay, I didn't see that.
So Turkey was the biggest piece of the Ottoman Empire, and it was the leader of the Ottoman Empire. The leadership was all centralized in Turkey, and Turks were the leaders of the empire, the Turkish government. So it was kind of interchangeable, saying the Turkish government and the leadership and government of the Ottoman Empire at the time. And when the Ottoman Empire fell apart at the end of World War I and a new Republic of Turkey was established, many of the leaders and perpetrators of the Armenian genocide were part of that new leadership of the Turkish Republic. So it was very important for them to perpetuate or put in place this campaign of denial that just expanded and deepened, went international basically during the successive governments until now. As we all know and tell our children, it gets harder and harder to reverse a lie the longer you repeat it, right? So, and there's question of reparations. There's the question of properties lost and not just lives lost. There's many questions related to it that the government found much easier just to deny than to wrestle with.
Yeah, the one thing, Roxanne is right. The one thing I would add is that very much the Republic of Turkey was built on the spoils of the Armenian Genocide. Much of the wealth, many of the properties that were confiscated, in fact, by law under the Republic of Turkey, they confiscated what they called abandoned properties. So the Armenians who were driven out, who were killed, who were deported, their lands all turned over to the government. So did many of the church properties, communal properties, etc. And so the Republic of Turkey was basically built on the bones of the victims of the Armenian Genocide. And because, I mean, any objective analyst would see that there's always the fear that, well, the Armenians are going to come back, they're going to ask, you know, for reparations, for the lands they were driven off of, etc. And so it's the combination of both, as Roxanne pointed out, that is why Turkey has so vociferously denied the genocide.
And Dikran, Dr. Khalikian, can you introduce yourselves? We didn't have you just have to do that.
Dikran Khalikian, I teach at Worcester State University, and I've written about Armenian genocide, especially genocide denial.
Dr. Khalikian is a board member of the Genocide Education Project. So he's joining us by phone now. Thanks, Dikran.
It was an excellent question, excellent discussion. Thank you both. One thing I want to add in too is that, as Roxanne alluded, you know, once you tell a lie, it's always hard, you know, to keep telling lies. And once you tell your version of history, you kind of have to stick with that. In dealing with Germans after the Holocaust, you know, there were no Nazis in Germany, and that is kind of the tongue-in-cheek way of saying people didn't want to know what their grandparents did, what their parents did during the Holocaust. And I think that same mentality is very alive, especially right after World War I, about Turks and their ancestors. As they look back today, they don't want to think about that their ancestor may have been a rapist and a murderer and a plunderer. As I think that's a pretty relatable human nature. I don't want to think the worst of my ancestors either, even if I didn't know them. So unfortunately, just human behavior as well. We're going to spend a little bit more time talking about Turkey, maybe at the end of today, but especially when we get into December too. Okay, and somebody also mentioned in the chat, and I just want to point this out, that Kosovo is not represented. Is also important, so is Bosnia. Absolutely. I just want to reiterate that we are not saying that they aren't. These were just the ones that were developed, but I always taught Bosnia and Kosovo in my class as well, so I understand. All right, so when I would teach this with my students, we would talk about the Genocide Convention, which we've already done tonight, and then I would introduce them to the stages of genocide. I just want to give you a little input or wisdom, I guess, from when I taught it, and hopefully you don't make the same mistakes I made, or have the same complications, I guess. My kids, if I didn't separate these two items, the UN Convention and the stages, they would mix them up. So just be aware of that. Maybe your kids won't do that, and that's awesome. But I had to be very cognizant of not putting these two items next to each other on the same day, as my students would invariably begin to blend them. And I wanted them to keep that legal definition separate. So the stages of genocide can also be considered warning signs. So as we're looking at a society, we can look at some of their behaviors and say, oh, that's troubling. And it's troubling because we know that that has in the past led to genocide. It does not mean that it will lead to genocide. I think that's really important to point out to your students, because as we go through some of these examples, your students may start seeing behaviors and policies that exist in the United States today that they find troubling. And so you do want to prepare them that this doesn't mean genocide is coming, but it is a warning sign. And then what do we do with this information? And I need you to be prepared for that in the classroom too, just in case you get a parent who pushes back and is confused why you're talking about some of these issues. That way you're better prepared as well. Classification. Classification is the division of society into groups. I mean, this is a pretty obvious picture of classification here in the US from the Jim Crow period. And while we typically see these stages move in a particular order, or they tend to have the similar patterns, they can happen not in the order I'm presenting them, if that makes sense. Symbolization, this is the labeling of groups through symbols, colors, and dress. And these are not things that the group is choosing. So obviously we know German Jews during the 30s and 40s living in Germany did not want to wear the Juda, the Star of David, as a mark that they were different. And that's why symbolization is such a troubling sign. Discrimination, it's when the group in power withholds rights and power from the minority groups. Our example here is Executive Order 9066, the one from Roosevelt, who has all descendants, Japanese and Japanese descendants living on the West Coast, interred in camps, in concentration camps, where they lost their civil rights. Dehumanization, it is propaganda or speech or media that labels the minorities as dogs, rats, something inhuman, something subhuman. This example is President Aliyev of Azerbaijan as he speaks of Armenians. You can kind of see what he's calling Armenians. And this was in the past few years. This is very recent. And this is a very common form of Azeri propaganda. Organization, the perpetrators trained for murder, the minorities are targeted with violence. Organization means that the government is preparing the society to accept violence on this particular group. And so there becomes the socialization phenomenon where it becomes these behaviors that we know are immoral and are wrong become okay if they're directed at this person, and you don't need to worry about it. You don't need to say anything. We always have people that will object to this, of course, and we have people who will intervene, but this sets the attitude and the acceptance of violence in the society. This is from Sudan. And this year, Sudan is currently arming its civilians in an effort to eradicate the targeted group, because there is genocide going on in Sudan against the indigenous tribes there. Polarization, moderates are eliminated, emergency decrees to protect the nation are issued. This is one that when I would talk about this with my students recently, yes, this really got their attention because when you listen to politics today, of course, you're hearing these very polarizing sides. So that's something to be aware of in your classrooms, just so that you're prepared for that as a possibility. Our example is from last year. This is a Bosnian Serb creation of Greater Serbia. So we still see the Bosnian genocide is an unresolved conflict because we still see Serbia claiming in this map Kosovo, Montenegro, and wanting to also claim parts of Bosnia and Croatia. So this is that polarization. It's for us. We have to protect the nation from these others. Preparation involves a lot of euphemisms. So using these euphemisms to openly discuss harming the targeted group and the arming of perpetrators continues. This example was posted in Beverly Hills, California in February of 2023. The euphemism here, though it's not going to feel very subtle, I admit, is the four brothers will wipe Armenia off the map. Wiping is not the same word as murder. So we know what their intent is. It's to eliminate, that's a euphemism too, or murder all of the Armenians. But that's not saying it directly. So that's kind of the fine line between this euphemism. When we think about the Holocaust as well, the final solution was the mass murder of the Jews of Europe, but that wasn't what was said out loud in public. Persecution, the targeted groups are identified and segregated or separated from society. This is an artist rendering of the Uyghur in different concentration camps in China. You'll notice that these are males. Males are removed first from the targeted group because males represent the biggest threat to security and the strongest resistance. So you can see that this would definitely be concerning because we see that the men have been removed and that they've been separated. Extermination is the mass killing and removal of the targeted group. From the Cambodian genocide, the targeted groups were non-Khmer, which were the government in charge. Anybody who was of Vietnamese, Chinese descent, or somebody who was dissenting and not wanting to go along with the collectivization. And lastly is denial. Denial is actually one of the longest of the stages because it's ongoing. We just mentioned Turkey's denial of Armenian genocide, which is ongoing today. This is when the perpetrators try to cover up their crimes. They minimize the killing reports. They try to validate their actions. Everybody was doing it. Lots of people died. It was a war. Those kinds of comparisons. But in our picture, we have Talat Pasha, who was one of the architects of the Armenian genocide, and President Erdogan of Turkey today. And it's saying that the Armenian genocide of 1915 was fake, but today, let history play out properly this time to have a real Armenian genocide. And this was posted in 2020. Of course, Armenia is not the only genocide that is denied. I hope I didn't leave that impression with you. All genocides face denial, some more loudly than others, but it happens. So in our stages kit, we have this graphic organizer, which just goes through all of the 10 stages that we just discussed. And so I would have my students, and if I was being more time conscious, I didn't have a ton of time to talk about a variety of cases, I would put them into small groups, have them read the selection that's in the Stages of Genocide manual on the topic that they were assigned. They would then go through and find those events. And then once all the groups were done, we could do a sharing session of some kind so that all the students learned about all of those cases in a more timely and efficient manner. So this allowed for collaboration. And as one of the earlier things that I would do with students, I wanted them to get to know each other and engage in some team building and some teamwork, and not go into genocide by themselves and have to dig some of this tough stuff out by themselves. This way they had somebody to process with. So our reading selections are 2 to 3 pages long. This just gives you kind of an example, but we also include a graphic timeline as well as some appropriate pictures. And like I said, we have several of those cases covered, but we don't have all the cases of genocide that have occurred covered. Okay, so let's take a moment to pause and unpack, because I think that was a lot, and I want to make sure how we're feeling and how we're doing. If we have any questions, check in the chat. And of course, even Rwanda is facing denial, and that really always blows my mind because Rwanda did a fairly good job when it comes to reconciliation. I mean, comparatively, everything's comparative. But it's really sad that now that even they're facing genocide denial. It's sad that everybody faces genocide denial, but it's surprising. Any questions, discussions?
There's nothing in the Q&A at the moment.
Okay.
Okay, there's one in the chat. Are the reading materials available at different levels to allow access to greater number of students?
That is such a good question, Wendy. Unfortunately, we have not gotten to that part of our development, but it is something that we are considering and examining. I will say I taught high school. It was appropriate for my GenEd students. And typically I'd say it's probably written at a 7th, 8th grade level, maybe. For my students with reading disorders or struggles, my own son is dyslexic, so I get it. I always just adapted the material down for them. In my own classroom, we don't have that officially done on GenEd. I would probably just go find a little 10-minute video clip and have them work on that and kind of working through it that way, because if I was really trying to work around the reading and writing, I'd have to get a little bit more creative. But an excellent question. It's definitely on our radar, as is foreign language.
We do have on our website, we do list books, and we do have categories for them. In other words, whether they're appropriate, but generally they're, like Carrie said, from 7th to 8th and up. And we also have stuff that's really for teachers. So we will categorize it as adults plus.
Yes. And if you do have, if you're looking for a text and you have those kinds of questions, of course, please reach out and we will do our very best to support you. Sarah mentioned, giving kids this vocabulary, letting them know what these things are, that really empowers them. They can then begin to identify like, oh my gosh, this is happening, here it is. And that empowering our students is so important, especially when we're learning about genocide and keeping them safe in their own psychology. Okay. We will continue on. That was our pedagogy talk for the night. I hope that was very helpful for you. I hope that if you do have questions later on, that you will feel free to email us and reach out, and we'll be happy to support you. So we are going to move on to talking about historical and cultural Armenia. And I just want to kind of explain why I'm doing things the way I'm doing them in this order, because we talked about safe in and safe out. With the amount of time that we have tonight, I could have started digging into the Armenian genocide and then stopped, and I felt like that would not be a very good safe out. So instead, we're going to focus on history and culture and language and the wonderful parts of Armenia. So I think that's a really great way to go out. You're going to hopefully feel refreshed and not depressed from talking about pedagogy and genocide and these stages. And so just trying to model, practice what I'm wanting you to do as well. But also, if it didn't make sense why I grouped them, it should make sense now. So Armenia is an ancient kingdom. The first thing that I recommend you do when you start talking about Armenia is find it on a map for your students, because my students had no idea where Armenia was because I'm in Missouri. And I think I've had one Armenian student my entire career. So this is just such an unfamiliar space for them. And getting them to be able to find it and then to identify the other nations around Armenia. Of course, if you tell them look for Georgia, it's not going to be this Georgia. It's going to be a state. So that's always really important to make sure that you have your students recognizing where Armenia is in the world. On our map, it kind of gives us Armenia over time. You can see that Armenia at times was a very large and great kingdom, and at other times, as kingdoms do, it fell back and it became smaller. It was conquered by other peoples. We can see that this is kind of the cradle of civilization here. We have all of these ancient cultures and peoples mixing together and creating this rich tapestry. But the Armenian culture, even though we have all of these other influences, it is its own identity, its own culture, and its own ethnic group, its own genetic group. So it's really interesting to think that since before BCE, the Armenian people have existed. And today they still exist and they still practice a lot of those same cultural identities and language. And so Armenia, in the more recent history, we know was conquered by the Ottoman Empire. And then eventually after World War I, it became its own republic. But that didn't last because the Soviet Union and Turkey worked out a deal, and that's history for another day. So today, this is Armenia. It's a very small country. It's a very lovely country. Mount Ararat is sacred to the Armenian people. This is the mountain that is supposed, this is where Noah's Ark landed after the flood. So Armenians see this as their symbol. You will find pictures of Mount Ararat in Armenian homes, as well as the Armenian alphabet. Unfortunately, because of a treaty between Turkey and the Soviet Union, Mount Ararat lies in Turkey and not Armenia. But in this picture, we're actually standing in Armenia looking at Mount Ararat in Turkey. So it is very, very close on the border. Wine. Okay, so wine is important. Historically, we know the ancients really enjoyed wine. We enjoy wine today, perhaps. But the oldest known winery was found in Areni in Armenia. It is 6,000 years old. And if you look at the picture, you can see the caves. Those were caves that people lived in. So we know that ancient Armenians were winemakers, that they had that ability, they had that technology. In the same cave complex, the oldest known shoe was found, and it's 5,500 years old. And I just like to point out to you, just because we all need a little chuckle, they had wine before they had shoes. And of course, obviously they didn't, but that's the order we found them in, and I think that's always fun. Armenians are the first nation to adopt Christianity. They adopt Christianity as a state religion in 301 CE. The seat of the Armenian church is called Etchmiadzin. It is in the town called Etchmiadzin. And the Armenian church is structured in a similar way to the Roman Catholic Church, though for Westerners, the Armenian church definitely looks more Orthodox than it would Roman Catholic as a Westerner. That's how it looks to me. But it does have its own structure and its own hierarchy. And Armenians are still very devoted to the church, whether they are spiritually religious or not. It is part of their cultural identity. So they do see this as one of their symbols, even if they're not necessarily practicing Christian of Armenian faith. This is the Amaras Monastery in Artsakh. It was created by Saint Gregory the Illuminator, who is the saint who brings Christianity to Armenia. This was created in the 5th century. Saint Mesrab Mashtots opened the first Armenian language school here in 406 CE. So about 100 years after adopting Christianity, Mashtots decides, he's a priest, he decides that the Armenian language needs to be written so that Armenians can be literate, they can read their Bible, and they can be more observant Christians. And so Mashtots takes the sounds of the Armenian language and creates symbols to represent those sounds. And so that is created in 406 CE. And here it is. This is an Indo-European language. It looks quite different. It is related really to itself. Mashtots creates a few other alphabets, Georgian, which is just to the north of Armenia today. And it looks a little similar, but it's not. So in this alphabet, you'll see the red letters. Those are vowels. Everything else is a consonant, and each letter represents its own unique sound. So one of the most important identities for Armenians is this language, is this unique language that has been with them since 406. Obviously in 406, it's an older version, just like we have Old English, there's Old Armenian. But these letters are still the same. The letters really haven't changed a whole lot, nor has some of the grammatical structure. So one of the fears after the Armenian Genocide was the loss of cultural identity. And so language really did become even more important for diasporan Armenians to hang on to their cultural identity and to raise their children in households that also spoke Armenian. Obviously, not every Armenian in the diaspora speaks Armenian, but they are familiar for the most part with this alphabet. And it's just really part of their cultural identity. So that takes us to our next free resource that we want to share with you tonight. This is called Armenian Bird Letters. It is available for free download at genocideeducation.org under the teacher resource page. This lesson is appropriate for younger ages because it doesn't talk about the genocide. It talks about Armenian language, it talks about art, and it talks about culture. It may mention the genocide in passing as an event, but it doesn't talk about murder. So it tends to be a little bit friendlier for our students who are a little bit more sensitive, maybe not ready for something as serious, such hard content. It's also a great way to ease your students into studying the Armenian Genocide. I was lucky I had 2 weeks, so of course I could spend my time here. But it's a great way for them to connect with a culture that is going to be, or at least feel, probably pretty different from their own, unless they are Armenian. The opening activity is a gallery walk. I'm going to show you a few of these pieces tonight. These are illuminated manuscripts. So these are holy books and Bibles from Armenia. They were commissioned by different individuals and communities for their use and protection. So these sacred texts are believed to be bringing you good luck, good charm, protecting the community. The texts I'm sharing with you that are in our gallery walk are from Western Armenia, which was part of the Ottoman Empire. And these texts were all saved in some way or another from the genocide, from being destroyed. So when I would have my students do the gallery walk, I could either print these off and hang them around the room if I needed to get them up and moving, or I could push this onto my learning platform and have them just scroll through a PowerPoint of these images and pay attention to things I might ask them to consider, the colors, the animals, the shapes, the intricacies, materials, just kind of look at them, think about them. What are we noticing? And how do these texts tell us, or what does it tell us about the culture? So that's what I invite you to do as we go through these. I'm just going to put them up and then just be quiet and let you look at them, and then we'll click to the next one. Yeah, I think that these have so much use in the broader context. I mean, for our art teachers, for ELA writing prompts or just social studies writing prompts. The collection that we have is small because it suits our needs, but if you were to explore the collection at the Mata Nataran, which is where these books are housed, where they are, the library there, they have a wide online exhibit. So that's a really great suggestion you can use. I do want to take a moment because I want to talk about the homilies of Mush. That's the one we're looking at now, just because it's such an incredible story. As you can see, this one is quite big. The other books are not this big. They're like normal book size. This one weighed 60 pounds. It was 27 inches long. It was enormous. And the story is that two women from Mush were fleeing the genocide. And they escaped to the church. And they found the book. The book had not been buried. It hadn't been hidden, to where the Turks were going to find it. And the women knew that if they found this, they would destroy it. So they had to decide what to do. Them carrying it by themselves was not going to be an option because it's 60 pounds. So they made the very tough decision to cut the book in half, to break the binding. And each took half the book on their journey to safety. So each woman, they're getting in secret, so no one knows that they're smuggling these books. One woman is able to get her portion to Etchmiadzin in Armenia, so it comes to the church. The other one is actually buried with the woman. Once she dies, it's discovered that she has this on her, and her companions don't know what to do. So they bury her, they bury the book with her, and each of them makes note of where this grave is. Once the conflict is over and the Russians come in and are providing security, they are able to go back and give her proper burial and secure the book. So it's an incredible thing to think, like, people are fleeing for their lives. And they also take these books with them. And this could not have been easy. But that tells us how significant, how important these books were to the Armenians, to their communities. And I just think that's so compelling. It tells us so much about the culture because we can see this value in the art, in literature, in religion. I'm done nerding out on it. I'm sorry. That is one of my favorite stories, though. It's just so heartening. The next activity we have students do with this lesson is a background in Armenian language and learning about the history of the Armenian alphabet, cultural expression, the use of art, how these books kind of come into existence, why they're so important. So more like a little web quest activity. You could have students do this whole thing independently, or you could break them into groups and have them do 3 different chunks and then get together in jigsaw. One portion of it, of this activity that is one of my absolute favorites, is this video, and we're going to take the time, and hopefully the internet smiles on us, to watch this tonight, because it is such a beautiful story of rescuing one of these ancient books.
Sitting in her Los Angeles dining room, my mother Helen took one last close look at our family's most precious heirloom. For 100 years, the Dadayans have served as custodians of this 15th century Book of Gospels, or New Testament, handed down through time and traveling across continents. Now it would take one last trip. The manuscript was scribed in Jerusalem in 1471 and taken to St. Kevork Church of Godarich village of Charsanjak province in historic Armenia. Considered to have healing powers, the book became well known as Harashapar Harashakords, meaning miraculous words, miraculous works. Armenians and Kurds came from all over the area to hear passages read from its pages. When the Turks began the genocide of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire,
It's kind of being glitchy. Carrie, can you hear me?
And their properties were destroyed. The Dadayans lived in nearby Lusadarich village. In 1915, my great-grandfather Sarkis and his 5 brothers were all, for various reasons, away from home. It was his wife, my great-grandmother Yersa, who was tasked with leading the other wives and children all to safety. Instead of following the deportation orders that would lead to death, she took the family east, finally arriving in the safer Russian-held Armenian city of Yerevan. Volunteering in a hospital there, one day Yersa was summoned by a patient who knew her from Charsanjah. Uncertain of his fate, he trusted Yersa with the Book of Gospels, which he had rescued from St. Kevork Church. Carrying the book and the heavy responsibility that came with it, Yersa emigrated to Marseille, France. She later took it with her when she joined her son Hovannes, now John, in Davenport, Iowa. When Yersa passed away, and then John, his wife, my grandmother Araksi, brought the book with her to Los Angeles to join my mother and our family. I have moving memories of growing up with Grandma and often begging her to show me the Bible one more time. Every so often, she agreed, gently pulling it out from her bottom dresser drawer, laying it on the bed, slowly unwrapping the colorful cloths, each one a bit more delicate than the last, and batting away my hand when I tried to touch it. When Araksi left us in 1990, my mother became the book's new guardian, and with the wholehearted agreement of her brother Hrair, we made the trip back to Armenia in summer 2017 to deliver Hrashapar Hrashakords to the Madenateran National Museum. Together, we were a dozen members of the family from LA, San Francisco, New York, Paris, and Yerevan, chaperoning the book home.
Մարդը նվիրում է իր ընտանիքում պահպանված եւ սերնդեսերունդ փոխանցված մի մասունք, որը ոչ թե պարզապես ազգային արժեք է, այլև հենց այդ ընտանիքի համար սրբազան մասունք է։ Եվ այդ իմաստով նվիրատվության կարևորությունը, նշանակությունը կրկնապատկվում է։
Իսկապես զարմանալի, անիմանալի է մեր ձեռագրերի պատմությունը, ճակատագրերը երբեմն այնքան խաչաձևում է մեր ժողովրդի ճակատագրի հետ եւ նրանցից յուրաքանչյուրը մի երբեմնի ծաղկուն վանքի, եկեղեցու, մի ընտանիքի գերդաստանի պատմություն է ներկայացնում եւ հաճախ հերոսները նույնն են։ Այդ պատմությունը կարող է երկարել, խառնվել, ձգձգվել, բայց պատմությունը հերոսներով է ընդհանրապես ուրվագծվում։ Այդպիսի մի պատմություն է ահա ընկած այս ձեռագրի երկար, այդ ճանապարհորդությունների եւ պահպանման հերոսական ճիգերի առջև։
Այսօրվա մեր նվիրատուները, թե նաեւ մենք մեր ազգային արժեքների պահակներն ենք։ Սրանք մեր հետագա սերունդների, մեր ազգի հիշողության վկայություններն են։ Մի խոսքով մեր նվիրատուներին նորից շնորհակալություն եմ հայտնում, ձեր վարձքը կատար, դուք ձեր պահակությունն արել եք, այդ պահակությունը մեզ եք հանձնում արդեն։ Մենք էլ մեր հաջորդներին ենք հանձնելու։ Շատ շնորհակալություն։
Եղսային թորները եւ ձորերը հոսեն այսօր եւ նույնիսկ ֆրանսայեն իր թորը ֆրանսայեն եկած է Մարկրիտ Քույումջան անիկայալ ներկայ է որովհետեւ Եղսան մեզի համար շատ կարևոր անձնավորություն է մեր ամբողջ Գերտաստանը Եղսան փրկած է Հրայրին եւ իմ կողմես սիրով ուրախությամբ հուզումով հրճվանքով գնվիրենք այս մեր ավետարանը այս մադենաթարանին թերևս ծիծաղեք բայց ես ցայն մլսեցի հայոց լերներեն եւ կարծեմ թե այս Սուրբ Ավետարանը ինձ իսա որ երթամ ննչել զիմ Հայաստան երթամ ննչել զիմ Երևան եւ ուրեմն ահավասիկ ցեզի գնվիրենք հայ ժողովրդին այս Սուրբ Ավետարանը
It was hard to miss the expression of relief Mom was feeling when the Gospels were safely back in Armenia. With a deep sense of respect and affinity for our heritage, we all felt a sense of pride and gratitude for our parents' and grandparents' role in preserving this ancient manuscript and helping put the pieces of our nation back together.
So I know there were some technical glitches, but I think you got the message, and it's just such a great piece. And my students always loved this. And then they always, I mean, Roxanne is on the call tonight, and one of my favorite parts is when she talks about getting her hand slapped because it's very Roxanne. But I would be able to tell my students like these are people that are here with us and that we can talk to who are descended from this. And so it's just this really powerful connection to what it means to be the guardian of a culture. And that's just really so important to Armenians, is to be this guardian of the culture. Okay.
Carrie, I did drop it in the I did drop it in the chat if anybody wants the link.
Thank you, Seta. I meant to point that out. Yes, the link for that video is in this lesson, in this unit, but it also is in the chat for you from Seta, and it's on our website. So if you were to lose it, don't panic. We can find it for you, of course. But it's just really a lovely piece. So the next activity that we have students doing follows on the heels of watching this video. And it's a big paper silent discussion. If you're not familiar with this, the concept is that you take your stimulus material. In this case, we're going to take 3 different quotes from 3 different people from the video and put them around the room, or we could use this on a digital platform. But we're going to have students walk around and read the quote and then write their thoughts on the large paper. And then they can begin to have conversations through writing with each other, like, I think this about this, and oh my gosh, I think that too, what about? And so we begin to engage in kind of this discussion that doesn't involve talking, which can be really helpful some days for us as overstimulated educators. But for our students who need to work on developing our writing skills, and also our students who are just shy and quiet, it's a nice way to also engage them as well. You could do this like on a Padlet if you needed to do it in a digital manner. So I'm just going to ask you as we go through these 3 quotes to kind of think like, what would you write? Like, what are you thinking about? So hopefully that gave you a little bit of a chance too to kind of process and decompress. We are going a little fast. I am throwing a lot at you, so I apologize for that. I do want to get to the fun part. I mean, it's all fun, but this is like the super fun part of the lesson and activity. We create Trochnikir. Trochnikir is Armenian for the bird letters. This is an example of what's in the lesson. But we have students transliterate their name pronunciation. So you'll see this first letter makes an ah sound, but it's linked. So when you play it, you can hear like, what does ah sound like in case the example isn't helping put it together into your mind. So we have students then transliterate their name based on how they figure out the sounds of the Armenian language and create it in Trochnikir. So these are just a few examples. Obviously, the top two are artists. I hope so, because it's amazing. And the bottom two are also very lovely. So the top left is Ashley. And then across is Kylie. The bottom left is, oh, I don't remember. Roxanne, what did we say bottom left was?
We said it was Tanya.
That one's Tanya. And then I thought the other one was Tanya. So now I'm
Camilla.
Camilla. That's right. We had the whole discussion about Camilla. So these students went through and transliterated their names. You could just have them do the first letter of their first name. I mean, you don't have to do the whole name. These are overachievers. But the instructions on how to make the art are all included in the lesson plan. So if you're not very artistically inclined, don't worry, we covered you. Because I'm not. So I had to make sure that it was something I could do. So I'm going to take some time just to discuss what we covered and answer any questions. I know Seda mentioned that there was a really good question in the Q&A, so I would like to head to that, unless Seda wants me to do something else first.
Well, it just goes back to the pedagogy. So it's like I teach 8th grade at a school that is primarily composed of students of East African descent. I've encountered situations where students have relatives that may have experienced violence in Rwanda as well as Somalia. What are some of the strategies to address these topics in a classroom where it can be very personal?
Right. This is such a good question. And I'm a little embarrassed that I didn't bring this up when we were talking about pedagogy. Trigger warning. Even in my classroom, we would have trigger warnings because we know that children experience all sorts of different things that we can't all know about. But especially in your situation where you have these descendants or they've experienced violence themselves, I think the number one thing when we teach, honestly, it's building relationships. I mean, we all know that. And so establishing those relationships with your students prior to talking about genocide, and then talking about it very openly in a general term as like, we're going to learn about different genocides and we're going to learn about these specific topics. And I understand that some of you may be uncomfortable. This might be hard. And so I want you to come talk to me about that and let's figure something out. I ran into lots of instances where young ladies experienced sexual violence. And so on days that I knew that that was going to be discussed, I would definitely warn them in advance. And I always had an alternative assignment or activity for them to do, not in the class. But you will definitely need to find a solution that works for you, obviously. But I think just being open and honest and listening to them, for some of these kids, maybe it's not talked about at home. Maybe it is. We all know that genocide survivors don't always openly talk about their experience. And for some, this might be the first time they really learn about it because their parents, their grandparents did not discuss this. And that's not unusual with genocide survivors. So I hope that helped. If anybody has some suggestions too that they feel would really be supportive. I welcome those as well. I think because you're thinking about it, you're going to be just fine, and your kids are going to be safe because you're thinking of them. All right. Oops. Any other comments, questions, ideas? I want to thank you all for being with us tonight. I know your time is really valuable, and I know as teachers, your time is very limited. So I'm really honored that you spent your time with us tonight, and I hope that it was very helpful. We do have a survey here. We will also send a follow-up email with the link in it. So if this isn't something you can do right now, you need to percolate, that's absolutely fine. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Roxanne and Dikran and Seda for being here and supporting this work as well. And I hope that you will join us in December when we talk about the Armenian Genocide specifically. And of course, in the meantime, if you have any questions or needs, you will reach out to us and we will support you in whatever way we can. So thank you all so very much and have a wonderful evening.